and cooked the whole thing up in order to kill and terrorize the American population. And think about it. They didn't just crash airliners. They actually used weapons of mass destruction on the homeland of the U.S. Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And they launched it 1 week after September 11th.
Right. So, in other words...
So they had it ready to go.
Yeah, they had it ready to go, because it isn't easy to prepare this stuff. It takes a long time, and it takes a multidisciplinary team. And that's why I perhaps should say another word here. The FBI has come out with what I would call a limited hangout position. In other words, where you reveal part of the truth so that you won't have to reveal the really dangerous truth. So they now admit that it comes from the heart of the U.S. military intelligence community, but they say it was a lone nut. And you can never yeah, right, we've heard that one before. And you can never really rule out lone nuts. I mean, they infect society here and there and everywhere. You know, when you discover one, it's too bad, but it doesn't tell you anything very significant because these people are irrational, unpredictable. And they eventually settled on Dr. Bruce Ivins, who worked at USAMRIID in, a U.S. military research institute in Fort Detrick, Maryland. He had cooperated with, he had done a lot to help them with their investigation, but they turned on him and said, no, we think it's him. And they came out publicly and said that 1 week after he died. It's really quite cruel when you think of it. I mean, it appears that I don't know whether they literally assassinated him. It's possible. More likely, they drove him to an emotional crisis. They claim he took his life with an overdose of Tylenol because of, they say this is proof of his guilt. Well, this isn't proof of his guilt at all. If it's a proof of anything, it's that they hounded him. They hounded his family, his children, his co-workers. They told him they were going to nail him. They were going to use the death penalty. The one thing we know is that he was in a terrible emotional crisis. However, did he take his life? I have no idea. They performed no autopsy. Can you imagine that? So
no.
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know if he killed it. But anyway, he died, the poor guy, after all the crap they laid on him. And then a week later they come out and say, he's the guy who did it. And, the fact that he killed himself just shows, that he did it out of guilt. And I just find that so outrageous. And, last year they published a 92-page document in which they lay out the case for Bruce Ivins as the killer. And I just think the whole thing is almost beneath discussion. At best, at its very strongest, they have some circumstantial evidence of his involvement. At its worst, it is the kind of thing that I would fail if an undergraduate handed me a paper like that. It is so outrageous. So they never show that he did this. They never show he was involved in this. But the guy will never have a chance to defend himself in court. The best he can do is his lawyer, fortunately, has given a couple of very good interviews, which you can find on the Internet, explaining the absurdity and the insufficiency and the inadequacy of the evidence against him. And fortunately, a number of his co-workers, former boss, these people have come out in his support and have said this is nonsense. So here's the FBI. They're going to do damage control. Yes, we have to admit it came from our labs, from highly, highly secure places. It's not easy to get anthrax out of these things. But it was a lone nut. And I'm saying if you look at the evidence carefully, you find not only is it not Bruce Ivins, it can't be any individual. It's a group, and this group nested in the heart of the military, industrial, intelligence community in the U.S. And there's every reason to believe this group was linked to, or was in fact identical with, the group that pulled off 9/11.
That's the key point, and I agree with you based on what you lay out about the anthrax attacks. And there's another dimension which I think is important to go into here, which is the connections between the 9/11 alleged hijackers, right. Where they were located there in Florida, where the anthrax attacks occurred, also in the same area. And then this amazing story of Mohammed Atta and his application for, or his attempt to get hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy a crop duster. Would you lay that out for us?
Yeah.
And,
so
and the implications that has.
Yeah, let me just back up for a minute to explain why this is important. So, again, often if I give a talk on 9/11, I'll start with a few words now about the Anthrax attacks. And generally, my point is a very, I suppose you could say basic or vague, but nonetheless important. It's meant to answer people who say, oh, the government would never do this, or, the military-industrial complex would never kill Americans, or they'd never do a false flag, and those kinds of general objections. I say, well, look, we know enough about the Anthrax attacks that even the FBI admits that, in fact, all of this was done, and it was done a week after 9/11. So what you believe, if you reject that 9/11 was an inside job and a false flag attack, you're saying that on 9/11, real extremist Muslims attacked the United States, spread terror, killed Americans, and so on. And a week later, fake extremist Muslims attacked the United States, killed people, caused panic, and so on. Now,
right.
Of course, it's possible that real ones did it and then fake ones did it. But I would think any rational human being learning about the Anthrax attacks would say, well, gee, wait a minute. If the fake Muslims did it starting on September 18th, maybe the other ones were fake too. So that's the way I generally use Anthrax in my general 9/11 talks. However,
yes.
What you're asking is a more specific thing. You're saying, okay, that may be useful, but is there evidence that the same people actually were involved? In other words, that there were connections between the perpetrators of the Anthrax attacks and the so-called 19 hijackers on 9/11. And I'm saying, yeah, there is evidence that they were connected. And it's evidence of various kinds. So we can start with what you mentioned, the Florida connection. At least 14 out of the 19 so-called hijackers had been active in Florida. Florida is a really important region for this whole 9/11 operation. And, I generally provide a map of the places in Florida where these guys were active, and it's the southeastern shore of seaboard of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And it's right in the middle of that area where the first anthrax victim died. His name was Robert Stevens. Now, by itself, that may not seem like a very big coincidence, although if you look at a map of the United States and you see what a small area that is, it's going to at least raise a few flags for you.
Yes.
But when we begin to follow the Robert Stevens trail a little bit, it gets even fishier. Now, Robert Stevens was a photo editor at a tabloid in, I believe it was Boca Raton, and the tabloid was called The Sun. It was owned by the same company that owned the National Enquirer. Now, at that time when he was working at The Sun, the general editor of the paper was a guy named Mike Irish. And Mike Irish's wife, Gloria, knew 2 of the 19 hijackers. In fact, she not only knew them, she was a real estate agent, and she had procured apartments for them. So here's the wife of the editor of the magazine finding apartments for Hamza al-Ghamdi and Marwan al-Shehi. And here's Mohammed Atta, the scary leader, co-signing on Marwan al-Shehi's lease. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there are 3 hijackers who are all connected to the Irishes and therefore to the Sun, where the first death occurs. Now, again, that could be coincidence, but the odds are pretty slim at this point. At this point, what I begin to see is that somebody's they're not trying to hide the link, they're trying to make the link. That there's these 19 hijackers are somehow connected to the Anthrax stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, when we look further, I mean, again, I'm not a major researcher on this, but I have found 5 incidents in which there is this kind of connection. And after a while, I say, I'm getting tired of coincidences here, something's going on. So many of these incidents have to do with crop duster planes. As you know, crop duster planes are planes that have tanks in them where you put chemicals and stuff, and you then spray them over the ground. And planes like this have great potential for destruction if you are able to modify them so that they can carry chemical or biological weapons. So there's a whole bunch of stories, some of which appear to be quite true, where members of these 19 hijackers were trying to get a hold of crop dusters before 9/11. And we have, as I say, more than one incident. We have some incidents that go as late as about a month before 9/11, where these guys are still allegedly trying to get a hold of crop duster planes. But the particular story you asked me about has to do with Mohammed Atta and an incident that happened in the year 2000. And before I recount the incident, let me try and unpack what I think is going on here. Again, there's some speculation, but I think that it's supported by evidence. I think what we're being led to believe here is that the same guys who did 9/11, the so-called hijackers, were interested in launching a biological weapons attack, almost certainly anthrax, on the United States, but that's why they wanted crop duster planes. And George Bush virtually said that in a press conference later. You know, we have found that these guys were involved in crop duster planes, and there's potential for chemical and biological warfare. We also know that Iraq had been associated with anthrax for quite a while in the U.S. public's mind, because it did in fact have an anthrax program for some years before all this was destroyed by the UN inspectors, and it did in fact experiment with dispersing the anthrax through planes. And if you look at Colin Powell's 2003 presentation to the UN, in which he told one lie after another.
Yes, the infamous presentation.
The infamous presentation makes all this very clear. You know, anthrax equals Iraq. Iraq disperses this through planes. This is very dangerous. It could happen in the U.S. homeland and so on. So I'm giving you all this background because I think what's going on here is that with all these hijackers running around supposedly interested in crop dusters, that this is supposed to be laying a trail for us, suggesting that these people were going to do an anthrax attack, and of course, we're going to immediately think of Iraq again as the supplier. So anyway, with that as background, here's the little story of Mohammed Atta. I call it the story of Mohammed Atta Seeks Alone. Yeah, so this was told in detail by the lone officer involved. Her name is Janelle Bryant. It was told in 2002, but the incident supposedly happened in 2000. So Janelle Bryant was a lone officer for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This happened in the spring of 2000 in Florida. She's sitting in her office, and a man enters. He wants a loan. He identifies himself as Mohammed Atta. Now, first you got to think about this. This is a guy who was at that time supposedly planning one of the most important top-secret operations ever conducted in the U.S. homeland. Right? He's the guy who's supposedly leading up this extremely secret attack that's going to be happening. So you have to keep that in mind. He comes in. He says, "My name's Mohammed Atta," and he spells Atta for her just to make sure she gets it right. He says, "I'm from Afghanistan," which is also interesting because the real Atta was from Egypt. It's not clear why he would say he's from Afghanistan. "I'm from Afghanistan," and more or less he says, "You know, I'm just a young boy with a dream. I just arrived in the United States, and my dream is to dust American crops, and I want therefore a loan of $650,000. Okay, this guy isn't an American citizen. He's just come in from Afghanistan. He walks into the office. I want $650,000 so that I can buy a 6-seater aircraft.